Hi Louise, how are you? How have you been?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you, Mary. Strange times, as we keep saying. Yes, how about you?
I've been okay. I mean, we were talking earlier in the week, weren't we, about the different sort of phases that you go through, I think, with this lockdown and the new circumstances that we find ourselves in. So it's been a learning curve and a process of having to open up to what is,
Yeah,
not forcing what one would usually do, really.
yeah, it's a great way of looking at it, and really staying with what that brings up. And I think that was
Yes.
something we were going to explore today. Moving on from the noticing to the opening, and that takes us into a completely different space, and means so many different things, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, it does, because we were talking about opening and the overwhelm that you can feel in a situation like this is because it is so different, but you're opening up to something which is different. But at the same time, if you're not used to it, we were talking about having a certain kind of framework within which
Yeah.
to understand and hold that. Otherwise, you just take absolutely everything on, and it's not balanced or it's not anchored by any sense of a sort of reasoning over
Mm,
that.
mm.
So that's quite a good point for us to really start off from, I think.
Yes, I think so. And like the word I think you used there was overwhelm. And I think there's a definite sense that people, particularly people that I've been speaking to, feel totally overwhelmed by what's happening right now. And that brings up so many more issues too. And this sense of overwhelm I'd like to kind of talk about as well in relation to my own method of inquiry in times such as these, and methods of inquiry that I've been using in the past, like thinking through the heart and Goethean inquiry. And I'm thinking specifically about my first interaction with Goethean inquiry with a plant called groundsel. And I remember when I first met this plant, I was totally speechless, totally overwhelmed. And that idea of overwhelm, it's whatever situation you find yourself in when you open up towards it, and there's no narrative there, there's no precedent there, there's nothing there to hold you. How
Yeah,
do you find yourself, how do you hold yourself in that kind of inquiry? And I think this is really, really important for the times that we find ourselves in today.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's interesting that we don't have a way of doing that in our modern age or postmodern age, because we've lost so much in the last few hundred years. And so it's not a case of finding brand new methods or finding new theories or angles or clever ways of dealing with things. It's actually a recovery of something that we've lost. And at the same time, it's being brought into the presence of your actual experience. And it takes us from a place of a theory of experience to experiential and experiencing what is happening um,
Definitely.
in the here and the now. So frameworks are very important indeed, because we don't really have many frameworks that assist us in that way, and the frameworks we do have become quite peculiar, to be honest, in some sense of the word.
Yeah,
So we're
definitely.
all scrabbling around trying to find ways of articulating things that we feel, and especially with, in your case, groundsel, when you encountered it, which is a beautiful plant or weed. Is it
Yeah.
actually a weed as well, a so-called weed?
Mm.
And that flood of initial joy or wonderment, perhaps, or almost the sublime, which can make us feel completely overwhelmed. But then knowing how to sort of ground that in some sort of meaning without losing the experience in its beauty.
Yeah, exactly. I was watching something by Charles Eisenstein this last week, and he was talking about, how do we stand in the whirlwind? And I thought that was such a beautiful way of articulating, maybe where many of us find ourselves right now. And this idea of, so going back to a framework, which for me would be, well, how would the heart see this? And at the same time, how would I inquire into this through a kind of Goethean lens? And it's
Yes.
sort of, I think we were talking about this last time, like a 180-degree flip, isn't it, really? Sort of moving upstream rather than downstream thinking, to use Henry Bultoff's language. And making that flip or that turn 180 degrees into a space that actually, an opening into that space, but also realizing that that movement in itself is quite brave. It's a brave move into somewhere that you don't know. It's a brave move to open up into something that is mysterious and unknown. And it's an interruption of the normal.
Absolutely.
Where we don't necessarily reach for a solution, and where, again, Charles Eisenstein says that we actually can't necessarily reach for a solution at the moment because these times are unprecedented.
Yes.
And it's not grasping for that exploration, but a holding as much as we can. And I'm not saying these things lightly, but it's a holding these things, or how we feel, or that holding ourselves in that space of the unknown, in a kind of open space of curiosity as much as possible, but at the same time honoring how we are feeling in that maelstrom of emotions and all kinds of stuff that's going on for us. It's this opening is not easy, and it can be very uncomfortable.
Absolutely. We were talking about this, picking up from last week, weren't we, about that it's not an either or, it's a both and. So at the same time, one can be feeling concerns about where your income might be coming from next, or what am I going to do for work since you can't work anymore. And at the same time, the earth is responding very strongly towards us. And one thing I thought was quite interesting this week or last week was the price of oil, which became less than zero. And it was almost as if the earth has said, everything you've ever taken out of me, you've pillaged and pulled so much out of me. Now even the stuff that you've taken from me is worth less than nothing. And that felt like a very strong response from the earth. And of course that's tough on many, many, many levels. But and it's not to say that people aren't suffering, and the economy will suffer, no doubt, on many different levels, as are individuals. But it was very pronounced response, I felt, from the earth in that way, that we've just seen it as a thing, as a resource to be used, and pulled so much from her and disregarded every sense of living with nature harmoniously and localized. We've gone so global that it's become ridiculous. And this is the situation that we're in at the moment.
I think that's a really beautiful observation, Mary, and it really, made me stop and take a breath in. And it's really taking us back to the title of what we've termed these dialogues, really. The world is speaking to us. And how we live then is our reply. So really, what you've just said is the world is talking to us, and really how we now respond to what she's saying to us is the difference between continuing the way that we always have done, or really committing to have a conversation with her in a way that creates flourishing for all, for her and for us. It's, again, we're back to this both and, aren't we?
Absolutely.
And I think this is a really great time. If you wouldn't mind me, do you mind me just sharing my PowerPoints about Groundsel, because it's so personal in terms of what we're talking about. So as we're talking about sort of opening, the picture on the left-hand side is Groundsel, and she is seen as a weed. However, my experience with her, I no longer see her as a weed. I see her as a sentient, growing, beautiful being that is just as much a part of the world and the earth as I am. And the reason why I see that is because when I was working with Goethean enquiry, it was sort of about making an imaginal turn. So moving out of the rational, logical brain and more towards opening to the idea that it's possible to converse with another being, another sentient being. And not that you're losing rationality or critique, but that actually you're opening up towards a different way of being in the world that includes the rational critique, if you see what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
So this is why I'm sort of got the title there, Opening Heart and Head, because I take the heart through a kind of James Hillman lens, Henry Corbin lens, which is that the heart is an organ of imaginal perception. And for Corbin and for Hillman, the heart itself is the place that receives the images of the world. So the world speaks to us through images. And those images we understand through symbolic language and metaphor and poetic language. And so that seeing that way is sort of like an imaginal turn into an imaginal consciousness where you could imagine that, yes, okay, the world is talking to us, because if that's the way she speaks, then that is the way that I must receive her. I sink down into my heart first, to use Robert Romanishin's terms, and then move that understanding up to the head so I can analyze that or look at that a little bit further, but then pass it back to the heart so I can continue that conversation with whatever it is I'm in relationship with. And so this imaginal consciousness uses the intuition, the senses, the sensuality, imagination, intuition, and it's open and expansive. The thing about it is it waits in the not knowing, inviting another, whatever that other is, into relationship. And this way of knowing also allows a depth and paradox and the both and, which is what we were talking about last week. So you're not losing anything. And I think we said this last week, didn't we? We're not losing anything by doing this. We're just bringing something else alongside to have its rightful place alongside all of these different ways of knowing the world and all these different ways of knowing that we can be in the world.
I think that's so powerful, Louise, as well, because it reminded me of, again, a quote from Hillman, where he talks about insight and self-knowing and self-knowledge, as have all the ancient texts from ancient Greece and all the way through history, really. But he said it's not about just sort of sitting there and closing your eyes and turning in on yourself again and again. Actually, it's much more powerful to bring your attention to something out there in the world that you can perceive and engage in your mode of imaginal perception with that so-called thing. And it's not a thing, of course, but it's a beautiful plant. It's groundsel that you found. And it's a very powerful way of opening up different modes of perception and knowing. But it is that opening, because you have to bring something of yourself to it through and out, again, through this outward observation and attention, as well as a receptivity, which is the opening within you. Again, it's that both and.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you know, like you say, this isn't anything new. This is very ancient wisdom that, you know, has been sort of passed on to us through different scholars throughout history. So Henry Corbin himself was particularly influenced by Ibn Arabi, and who was particularly influenced by, you know, Platonic thinking. So these ideas aren't new. It's just that they're being brought back into consciousness, into awareness, because now more than ever we need these more expansive, open ways of seeing and being in the world.
So how would something like that look at for you? So would you actually have gone into an actual exercise with it, in a sense of engaged looking and seeing and perception,
Yeah.
and then the rational critique would come in afterwards, where you're grounding your insights and experiences in a sort of larger context of meaning.
Exactly, yeah. So just to move on to what would happen in Goethean inquiry. So this was something that I was asked to do as part of my master's course. And Goethe himself, obviously the poet Johann von Goethe, said that his idea was that everything is in the phenomenon itself. There is nothing hidden. And what we need to do as human beings, we need to carefully cultivate our mode of perception, which requires a fundamental shift of perception 180 degrees in a different direction upstream. So what you do is you engage your rational mind and your sensory experience, your imagination, your feeling, your tasting, your intuiting. And he had a two-step methodology, and which I put on the slide here. So the first step is exact sensorial perception, where you come into relationship with your subject of inquiry as clearly and deeply as possible, without preformed mental models, theories, and classifications. And you just sit there in the space with this other being. And step two is where you move away from that being, or you just close your eyes and you recreate the experience in your imagination to come to know the subject of your inquiry better. So you're sort of really then reinforcing it in your body, in your mind's eye, in your heart, if you like. And so this two-way approach means that it's kind of like a participatory movement. The plant in this sense is talking to you, you're recreating it in your mind, and you're going back to it and you're saying to the plant, is this the way that you're representing, is this the way you're presenting yourself? And the plant would, you'd sort of look again, and the plant would sort of say to you, yeah, but look a bit deeper, and this is the way that I'm presenting myself. And then you notice more as you do this two-way process. It's like a two-way conversation, really. It's very, very powerful. And it sounds now, as I'm talking about it, like it's really, really easy. But actually, it's not the easiest thing to do in the world when you've been educated into a particular way of knowing the world itself. So when I first started to do this with Groundsel, I ended up just being in this place of overwhelm. I think you used those words before, Mary. Totally overwhelmed. Didn't know what I was doing, didn't have any words to describe what I was doing. I thought that I was doing something really silly to start off with. But the interesting thing was that after the fourth or fifth day of me just sitting and looking at Groundsel, something happened. And it was like a revelatory experience, really, for me. And I suddenly had this sense of the aliveness of Groundsel. She became alive to me. It was something that shifted totally. And I saw that because of the reciprocal relationships that she had with the environment that she was in and with life itself, she was a living being. And so she actually gave voice to the warming rays of the sun and the richness of the earth and the life-giving power of rain. I actually felt that viscerally in every part of my body. And I know that sounds really simple, or yes, of course, that's of course what happens, but it was a sense that I was participating in the beingness of Groundsel, if that makes any sense to you. It was a total shift of seeing. And out of that overwhelm and out of that speechlessness came this sense of conversation and being at one with this plant. And I knew in that moment that that plant was talking to me, that Groundsel was talking to me, and Groundsel was responding, because she sort of showed me then these kind of all these different cycles in life itself on a deeply philosophical level. It changed my whole life and my whole trajectory and how I thought about nature from that point.
Gosh, that's remarkable. That's absolutely beautiful. And how frequently or how rarely do we experience something like that? I think frequently as children, we do it all the time. I think children are so in tune with that. I think it was John Betjeman, who said childhood is filled with sights and sounds, I can't remember the whole thing, until the dark hour of reason creeps in. And children talk to their dolls or their things, or they talk to themselves or imaginary friends or animals, pets, plants, all the time. And then we're told to sort of grow up, not be so silly, and become uber rational people. And this whole way of knowing gets completely blotted out.
Yeah.
But like you said, you don't have to lose anything. It's an adding to it.
Yeah, definitely. And it certainly was a sense of something being added. It was like I felt more alive, that actually the half-life, this kind of anorexic life, narrow view of life that I'd been living in, there was so much more that was open to me, that I was able to experience with nature. And it sort of helped me to develop a kind of an ecological consciousness. The sense that nature, plants, animals are just as important as human beings. You know, it sort of, and I knew that already, but it was like I was then put on the same level playing field as the rest of nature. And I can't tell you how that shifted my whole outlook on life. Really, it was just like I was being held by life itself.
That was like I suppose it was what, thinking about frameworks and so forth. If you look at the four senses hermeneutic, that would be your tropological turn, wouldn't it? Where you cross that threshold, really. And so was that while you were at Schumacher that this was an exercise that you did?
So I did it quite a lot then. You know, once I got past there was 5 days where I was totally in a place of not knowing. And we mentioned this at the beginning of the dialogue. Not knowing, my normal was interrupted. I was trying not to grasp for an explanation. I was in the mystery of the not knowing. What on earth was I doing? What was his conversation about? What was his conversation about? But I stayed with it. You know, that was the thing. I stayed with it. And then all of a sudden something broke through, which was this kind of experience that I had with Groundsel that shifted my whole attention and my relationship with the world. And I think, you know, if we're talking about, you know, what's happening in the present times, we are sitting with something that's totally unprecedented. And you know, I don't think necessarily that it's a great idea to rush towards solutions, because the old way of being in the world wasn't necessarily serving many, particularly not nature and the earth. And so how do we, the question that I'm kind of sitting with through a Goethean lens and through a kind of heart-centered lens, if I sort of move on to the heart sense and the model that I've been working with in my own PhD, you know, how do we sit in the not knowing, in the discomfort, long enough for something different to break through that could potentially offer us, or offer all things, all phenomena, the opportunity to flourish rather than the few. And so really working with Goethean inquiry and heart sense, and I believe that the two are intricately linked. This idea of insightful perception and considered discernment regarding daily life, which is a definition that I've developed for heart sense, using the wisdom and benevolent qualities of the heart. Really, if you bring Goethean inquiry and heart sense together in that sense and rest in the open space of the not knowing, where could we find ourselves? You know, what could break through? What has the potential to, how does the world, in that space that we've created for it, how could she speak to us? What could she say to us? And how then do we reply? You know, so this opening is really uncomfortable. But if we can stay with it long enough, what could have the opportunity to come forward, to reveal itself in that conversation?
Yeah, that's really beautiful. It's when you were saying about the opening, and it shifts you out of a place of security. And so many posts I've seen on Facebook or through friends' messages and so forth, and I've said it as well. I'm sure, you know, this is getting boring now. When are we going to be able to get out and see people and meet face to face? I think it's actually the social aspect that we've missed more than anything, because we are social creatures and we need each other. And if anything, it's brought me to the attention, certainly, of my friends and how much I miss them, and the lovely things we can say to each other, even though we can't physically see each other. But it brings you to this state of vulnerability as well, the opening. And it makes one feel very vulnerable, and we're not used to feeling vulnerable, and we always want to cover it up because we are rational human beings who live in postmodernism, and, you know, we're intelligent Westerners, and, you know, we've got this whole sort of history behind us that pushes you up to this place where you think you have to be in control all the time, and seem to be doing, you know, the right thing and so forth, which impedes on our ability to be able to, as you say here, open to perceiving in another way, and just allowing that space to remain. Actually, this whole space I would relate very closely to breath. The earth needs to breathe again, and breath, if you think about it, is our inhalation and our exhalation. It is the threshold itself that sits between our life here in our body on earth and our not being here in our body and somewhere else. And that breathing, that breath, does have to have some space, and the earth certainly needs to be able to breathe again. She's been choked and suffocated for a very long time. So I think just allowing that space, and I use breath as a metaphor here, but allowing it to just breathe and find its own rhythm and slow to a pace of a breath, rather than that we're always sprinting all the time, as most of us run through life. So there's a lot of beautiful things that can come from that. And really, I suppose what we're hoping is, yes, each one of us can make our own. You know, I'm certainly not here waving a flag saying I'm going to change the world, because I can't. And I can just be aware of certain things, and within our own way of doing things, we can make changes that we feel will impact on the earth in a positive way. But it needs to sort of happen in a mass shift where we become very aware of what's so wrong. And this sense of opening, and the heart sense that you mentioned, and go really into, is a beautiful way of being able to navigate that pathway through there.
I mean, it's definitely something, Mary, that is supporting me at the moment in, you know, having conversations with, seeing what's happening with the world, hearing her speak to me, like you say, about the fact that she'd been choked by, you know, everything that we were doing to her. And, you know, how do I hear her cry? And how do I now sit with how I move into the world, you know, post COVID-19? And these frameworks, like we say, having these frameworks are very helpful. So the Goethean inquiry and the heart sense for me are very helpful ways of being able to sit and listen to the world talking to me, to coronavirus talking to me, to my own ideas and anxieties talking to me, and holding them all together in some kind of messy space, because it is messy, the space that we're in right now. And just to be in that space of opening and waiting
Yes. Yeah.
And
And
so
every day I think you can take a breath, you know, you can breathe. It's even if one is in a state of panic or, as you said, anxiety and not knowing, and there are very real things that are causing that. This is not an imagined state. No. This is very real, and it's based on circumstances outside of ourselves that we currently have no control over. And so that sense of being able to just remind yourself every day, I have light on my body and I can breathe air, and as long as there's some food to eat, for today I'm okay.
Yeah.
And we don't know what might happen tomorrow at the moment, but we can start to think a little bit towards that.
Yeah. And so I was kind of wondering, you know, now I've shared the frameworks really that help me and support me, what kind of things, Mary, make sense to you at this particular time?
I think a lot of what we said in the beginning about this complete slowing down of the pace, and what we called normal wasn't so normal anymore, and doesn't feel normal anymore. And there are certainly moments where I'll not panic, but think, goodness, you know, I wonder what might happen tomorrow or next week, that I just don't know. But I'm actually becoming quite used to being in this not knowing space. And a lot of reflection for me, going back to sort of reflecting on childhood and so forth, not in a kind of overly sentimental way, but certainly it feels like a very real going back sense as well to a time of life, and certainly a pace of life, when what I'm experiencing now feels very much like my childhood in terms of the noise has stopped a lot, and the busyness has stopped, and the chaotic sort of just people running around everywhere doing this, doing that, 100 things a day to do. Everyone's always driving towards something, or and you know, this sort of thing. And it's very nice to sit and not have to engage with that. But my own frameworks really, I suppose, drawing on what we spoke about last week, and thinking about how our perceptions of nature and of art really help to shift and awaken something which we've forgotten for so long, and it's an open to, which is not an easy thing to do. And what really struck me actually was this sense of the opening and the overwhelm, which I suppose one would say is the heart opening and the mind opening in a certain way, but the importance of also being able to ground that and have a sort of tension at the other end of the sort of rational and the reasoning which might come from that. And it brought to mind, again, classical art for me, which obviously the Renaissance was reviving. And I thought about, I'm just going to share my screen, lots of things really. The fact that works of art many years ago were understood as being alive and animate in the same way that you talk about nature. And that you're not just looking at a work of art, or you're not just looking at a flower, it's also looking back at you. And that two-way sense that you are being seen, and that being seen helps to open up again in a particular way. And it also brought me to the sense of there's a tension, I think, that we have to deal with with nature, with anything we see of beauty, or with a work of art, in that the meaning of the work of art doesn't necessarily just sit behind it, but it is in it as well. And it's in that experience of it. So we're not just theorizing about an experience. And I just wanted to bring up this image of one of the statues that was on the Parthenon in Greece by a sculptor called Phidias. But even headless, the goddess has this sense within her that she's alive, that it's a moving living being in there, but really that can only come alive in your imagination and in your response to it. And it's not pointing only to something symbolic beyond it, but it's also embodied in it as well. And Rodin, who was a French sculptor, loved the statues from ancient Greece, and particularly loved to visit England and London, and went to the British Museum and looked at all the wonderful statues there. And he said about this particular statue that the goddess's pose is so serene, so majestic, that they seem to participate in something grand that we do not see. Over them reigns, in effect, the great mystery, immaterial, eternal reason obeyed by all nature. And I thought it was such a beautiful reminder of how something that we see, or a work of art, could have been created based on principles of, not, I don't want to say philosophy because it makes it sound like such a static thing, but an understanding of the cosmos in a different way, and of nature, which was absolutely seen as an embodied being. And her expression is in what you see. It's not just behind what you see, it's in it as well. And it brought to mind as well Myron's discobolus, or discus thrower, who was another sculptor around the same time as Phidias, which is the goddess that we've just seen. And these are Roman marble copies of his discus thrower, where the proportions and the harmony within the body and its stance are all directed by certain cosmic ratios and so forth, which I won't really go into now. But the original was bronze, and these are all marble copies. And the original would have been the discus thrower looking back towards his discus. But what I thought was so interesting about this work of art, this statue, is that he's perfectly balanced asymmetrically. He's not symmetrical, he's asymmetrical. And this shape here of his arms, and you can draw the shape of a bow here perfectly through his arms, and the shape of his curve, and then the straight line between the two hands. And it brought to mind, it sort of stood as a metaphor really. So this brought to mind a passage actually from Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher. And Heraclitus says in his fragments, that's all we have of his writing, he said, the cosmos works by harmony of tensions, like the lyre and the bow. And I thought that was a very relevant image for us today in what we're going through, that we have this sort of tension of the pulling towards something that we might have to live in a different way, and an old way that we're going to have to let go of. But there's a sort of harmony somewhere that we can find between that tension, that pull. And again, as you said, Louise, it is in that in between. It's that and that. It's an in between that grows from that participation in that. And it also brought to mind Dr. Ian McGilchrist's work, where he talks about the two hemispheres of the brain which attend to the world in different ways. And it's not what they do, it's how they do it. And they're both responsible for many things which are the same. And Heraclitus is a philosopher that Dr. McGilchrist quotes quite frequently. But he says about Heraclitus that he doesn't advise a turning inwards in order to discover the nature of reality, but a patient and careful attention to the phenomenal world. And I thought that was very relevant for us today as well.
Yeah.
He mentioned bow as well, and this is a quote from Ian's book. He says, the taut string, its two ends pulling apart under opposing forces, that for bow or lyre is what gives it its vital strength or virtue, is the perfect expression of a dynamic rather than a static equilibrium. And I thought that was really relevant for us to think of today in what we're going through, in that it's a dynamic place that we find ourselves in. It's not static, it's constantly moving. And this is a beautiful reminder,
Yeah.
this quote from Heraclitus of that. And I very much always like to see that in a work of art, or try to see what the metaphorical meaning is in a work of art, which doesn't skip over the beauty or the physical perception of it, but that it embodies a number of different things on a number of different levels, all at the same time.
Yeah.
So that really is the opening as well, is the sense of the bow and the lyre. Then you can't get that taut string and the tension between the two if it remains closed. So again, it has to open. So this beautiful sort of opening of something, but within that there's a harmony and an equilibrium. And I think that is also reflected in the analogy of the right and left hemisphere of the brain, or as you would say, you know, and through the heart, that the right hemisphere is not just something that sits within the brain. The mind is something much larger than that, but we need the two. And again, that's another framework. And I think looking at these ancient classical works of art, that these principles were very much understood in that way and embodied through the works of art, that without having a rational grounding of some sort, this work of art wouldn't be able to stand up. You know, the ideas might be there, but it would be swimming around in a sort of, you know, mess of marble on the floor. But the fact that it's come into being means that we do need to have a grounding of some sort, as well as something much bigger than that, and that the two can come together, and when they do, they actually create something rather beautiful.
Well, I think that's, you know, fascinating, Mary. And I think, you know, really today was looking at moving beyond noticing into opening. And, you know, really what we wanted to try and do was explore the frameworks that we each use to help us to maybe navigate life in a particular way. And you've really beautifully shown how your framework can be applied, you know, philosophically to your life and the things that you're experiencing. You know, in the same way that looking at a plant through Goethean inquiry and through, you know, applying heart sense, I can kind of look at, well, what does that mean in terms of what's happening for me in the world today? So they're very helpful ways of trying to hold maybe particularly the what we're experiencing right now in our world with coronavirus and being on lockdown. So I think if they've been able to you know, inspire or offer any support to, you know, people who are watching this, then, you know, that can only be a good thing, to sort of see a bigger, more expansive picture in terms of we're part of something wider, we're part of something more expansive. And when we see ourselves that way, between these push-pulls, between life and death, between these opposites, between these tensions, how do we navigate that? How do we hold that?
Yes, so that it's not always comfortable doing so. I think we always want to run for something which feels fluffy and nice, and it isn't necessarily going to, but it's through that sense of tension, again, it's that sort of pull between the two of something, that there is a harmony that you can find within that. It's that it's being able to hold a number of different levels and accept different things all at the same time, without feeling that we're not in control anyway of many things. We're in control of what we do with ourselves and our bodies and how we speak and all these things that we are in control of, but we aren't in control of whether there's going to be sunshine, rain, or an earthquake tomorrow, and we're not in control of certain pandemics at the moment that we are experiencing, or how the earth might respond. But I think it's a sense of acceptance as well, and in the acceptance there is an opening, too. But I think always to feel that there is, that we have, it seems like such an odd thing for us perhaps today in modern times, but to know that we are part of something much bigger that you can't really know. So it's nice not knowing that, but you can feel it when you engage in your sense of experience with nature or with a beautiful work of art, or be inspired or moved by beauty, because so many people go through life and never notice a beautiful painting or a plant that might just grab your attention in a certain way, or the light in someone else's eyes or face. Or so these things are important to notice, because they are what makes us who we are and make us human and experience being human. And again, I think that comes through your sense of the heart and being in the heart, that it's not all us being in the head and thinking about everything all the time, but it's bringing that into our experience.
There's a deeper layer, really, I think is what we're talking about.
No, it's been really fascinating, Louise.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. So next time we speak, our next session is about,
so week 3 is grieving. So we're looking at, because we've been exploring different ways of knowing, noticing and opening, but also in bringing that into the conversation, we're acknowledging that other ways of knowing have been open to us, but we've been educated to silence them. And I think it's important to actually make room for this loss, to grieve for the loss, and to consider how this loss might have affected us and the many, many different layers of all of this. So we're going to be looking at grieving in our next conversation.
Lovely. Okay. All right. Very much look forward to that.
Definitely, Mary. And keep safe.
Yes, you too. Thanks, Louise. Take care. Bye-bye.